Dear colleagues, dear students, and dear guests, welcome to the digital panel discussion, Women, Life, Freedom, that will address past and present of women's, but not only women's, political oppression in Iran. We are very happy that Professor Nima Nagibi, Dr. Bita Behravan, and Dr. Ali Fatollah Nejad have accepted our invitation on such short notice and are willing to share their expertise with us tonight. The event was organized by Professor Antje Flüchter, spokesperson for the Research Center Practices of Comparing, Professor Tomke König, spokesperson of the Interdisciplinary Center for Gender Studies, and myself, Dr. Birte Förster, spokesperson of the Profile Area Global and Entangled History. However, many more people were involved in its organization, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them. Professor Silke Schwand, Professor Stefan Gorissen, Karen Hamm, and Paula Bartels generously supported us in the preparation. I would like to especially thank Andrea Bendlage and Marina Bödecker of the Research Center Practices of Comparing. Without these two, our discussion probably could not have taken place in a virtual space, and you probably also would not have known about it. Thank you very much. It was, however, one of our students who initiated this event, asking if the University of Bielefeld could not address the protests in Iran. The student was right, of course, and we started organizing. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, our student convener will now give you a general introduction to the topic. Please.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. On September 13th, 22-year-old Mahsa Regina Amini, originally from the Iranian province of Kurdistan, was stopped by the morality police when she was waiting at the train station with her brother in Tehran. The pretext for taking her into police custody was that she wore her headscarf improperly or her jeans were too tight. While being forced into the police van, she is said to have received blows on her head. The police took her to a detention center to morally re-educate her. She passed away in a hospital in Tehran on the 16th of September, 2022. After the news of her death went viral, the suppressed social energy of 43 years of grief, humiliation, and rage was unleashed in the streets, schools, and universities of Iran. People heartily sympathized with her family, fearing that they, their sisters, their mothers, or their wives could be the next victims. The final straw emboldened citizens to take to the streets and fight against the corrupt and brutal regime and claim their basic rights. The tech-savvy Generation Z seems to be the backbone of the protests. They are fully aware of and insistent on their basic human rights. This gives them the edge to lead the way for the disillusioned millennials and the disoriented and directionless Generation X. The regime has responded by brutal crackdowns and shutting down the internet. They beat, incarcerate, or even kill people because they exercise their right to freedom of expression and peaceful protest. In recent years, the number and frequency of nationwide protests in Iran have been increasing. The last time the government had to grapple with a large-scale protest in Iran was back in 2019. The nationwide uprising was ignited by a dramatic hike in fuel prices, but they soon transformed into calls to overthrow the regime and its supreme leader. It's now remembered as Bloody November, since around 1,500 people were slaughtered by the regime for protesting. Iranian citizens are not just protesting the mandatory hijab, nor are these protests targeting any religious beliefs. Fed up with living under an oppressive theocracy, people are just demanding their basic rights. They expect the international community and the media to keep their stories alive and reverberate their cries for freedom. Nonetheless, there are serious downsides to the media coverage that threatens to stoke misunderstandings about hijab and women in Iran. While Women, Life, Freedom has brought a wide diversity of communities together, some platforms try to co-opt the protests and manipulate them for negotiating on a potential revival of the JCPOA or the nuclear deal, hence stifle the uniting cause of the movement. That's the reason why Universität Bielefeld has invited 3 experts to shed light on the situation in Iran. Thank you.
So I'm very pleased now to very briefly introduce our 3 distinguished experts. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Nima Nagibi. She's Professor of English at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her research interests are post-colonial and diasporic theories, human rights, memory, trauma, life narratives, and memoirs. Her most recent book, Women Write Iran, Nostalgia and Human Rights from the Diaspora, came out in 2016. It deals with life narratives and memory in the diaspora in different media, including the also in Germany well-known graphic novels by Marianne Satrapi. Welcome to University of Bielefeld. We are very happy to have you. Our second speaker is Dr. Bita Behavan from the University Duisburg-Essen, where she works at the Department of General Psychology and Social Psychology. Her research interests are cosmetic surgery, women, gender, dress codes, body image, identity, and belief systems. Among her publications is an article that addresses some of tonight's topics, namely her essay, Does Wearing Hijab Have Any Effects on Social Routine Behaviors of Women Across Cultures? An observational study on women in Germany and Iran. We will learn more about your fascinating research in a moment. Welcome to Bielefeld University, Dr. Behavan. Our third expert is the political scientist, Dr. Ali Fatollah Nejad, who is a McCloy Fellow on the American Council on Germany and an Associate Fellow with the American University of Beirut. His research interests are the Iran sanctions regime, the Middle East security system, and the 21st century world order. His most recent book, Iran in an Emerging New World Order, From Ahmadinejad to Rouhani, was published in 2021, and it seems like you have written the book of the moment. Also to you, a very warm welcome and thank you for coming and sharing your expertise on such short notice. Our chair tonight is my esteemed colleague Antje Flüchter, Professor for Early Modern History and spokesperson for the Research Center 1288, Practices of Comparing. This time I said it properly. Her research interests include the confessional age and perception and interaction between India and Europe in the early modern period. Distinguished guests, dear Antje, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Birte. Nobody has introduced you now, so as you said, you are the spokesperson for our area, Entangled History and Global History. You are a historian for modern history, and sorry, I have not your PhD and your second book, but you're also a global history. You're doing a lot about Africa, about gender, about infrastructure, and you're not so long here in Bielefeld, and we are very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
A warm welcome also from my side to all of you for the discussion. So great to have you here. It was not, we really tried hard. I'm very happy that you could make it on such a short notice. And we also thank everybody who's joining us via Zoom. We are now with 63 people. And I think Birte and me, we are quite happy. We didn't expect so many. So thank you to everybody. Our student already said a lot, but I will also repeat some of the things. I mean, since more than 1 month now, the most serious protests since 1979 are taking place in Iran. For the first few days and actually weeks, we learned about these events almost exclusively via Twitter or other social media. In Germany, the public broadcasters were very cautious with their reporting. In Germany, there is this none of the special popular Brennpunkte, that is a special broadcast after the main news, coming normally for everything what is something, and here still we had no Brennpunkt about the Iran. And instead, sometimes they almost verbatim took over the headlines of the Iranian state media. So if you think about when it was very clear broadcasted that Masha Amini was before her earlier illnesses, that was I think in the Austrian, they just did it, or the same when it was about the events in the Evin prison. It seemed sometimes like rather riots and associated some events in Venezuela or Brazil. So it was very strange sometimes if they reported. So the situation is very difficult to understand from us here sitting in peaceful Bielefeld, very provincial in Germany. And we also don't have the in-depth knowledge about the Iran, its social, cultural, and economic structure. And that was the reason we organized this panel. We thought information is the most thing that the European and German audience needs. If you look into the media, some media called the protests at the beginning Kopftuch-Proteste, headscarf protests, and made it very small with that. Yeah, then it became quite clear that it was more than that, but it's still difficult what it's about what. And we'd like you to explain in our first block. Can you explain to us what the Iranian women are protesting about, and what are the Iranian people generally demand? Because it seems so much more than just the headscarf. But also the headscarf, the hijab is important. So I would first like to ask Bita Behrawan, because you worked about the hijab, just to explain to us what is the meaning of the hijab psychologically, but here I think it has a very big symbolic political meaning. So could you explain this to us?
Yes, first, hello again. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and hello to all the audiences that are hearing us. Well, hijab, like any other clothing that we wear, can be used as a social symbol, of course. It can be used on an individual level and on a social level. It depends on the person herself, which idea she has. For example, if you look at with the article that I did, actually I wrote about, it was about the women who wore hijab in Germany and also women in Iran, because they have to wear hijabs of Islam. So the thing is, people, for example, in Germany who wear the hijab, or any other country that is has a secular political regime, for example, that is not religious, is kind of their own decision. But when it comes to politics, when it comes to the government and stuff, then actually the government is using this social symbol as a sign in order to show its own power. So the more the people, for example, especially women, have their hijab on their head, and the more they show it to the world that the women of our country are wearing the hijab, is actually a kind of strengthening their own ideology, I would say. And it's so different when I, as a woman, decide to wear the hijab just because I want to, and it's very different when I have to wear a hijab. Hijab, of course, can be very limiting for a lot of women, and especially if it is worn obligatory, you know, reactance will start. What is reactance? Reactance is when we start to show some reactions that happen after we feel like our freedom has been limited. And this freedom is limited, actually. So one thing that I have to say is that this hijab is not only something that women wear, it's also something that goes inside their minds and brains, because as a 7-year-old person, as a 7-year-old girl, when a woman goes to school for the first time, they have to wear hijab. And if not, they're not allowed to go to school and study. At 9 years old, women, girls inside the schools, they celebrate some celebration. We call it Jashne Taklif, which means the celebration of duty in a way. And the duty is that now you have become women, you have to wear your hijab, you have to do all those things. And with hijab comes a lot of other things, because hijab is actually a symbol for covering yourself in order to be safe from the eyes of the men who are looking at you. So it's kind of degrading, not women, also men. So I would say hijab is not just something that we wear on our head. It changes our lives. It changes our freedom. And each and everything that happens in our life gets kind of affected by it. I hope I have answered your question. If there is anything else, I can actually explain more.
I think we make the round and then we go back. Nima Nahibi, you are doing a lot about feminism in Iran and in the world. So in this slogan, women, life, freedom. So what are the women there? What is the meaning for the women there?
Okay, thank you so much. And I'd also just like to take a moment to thank the University of Bielefeld and Professor Fluchter and Professor Förster, and apologies for my pronunciation.
Same for us. Same for us. We also need to apologize. We try hard, but it doesn't work.
And thank you to all of the organizers of this event. It's a privilege and an honor to be here with all of you and with my fellow panelists. Yes, I'm happy to talk about that slogan, and also, if I could also piggyback a little bit on Dr. Behavan's comments as well. But first, I'll talk about the slogan Zan Zendegi Azadi, Woman, Life, Freedom, which comes from the Kurdish slogan Jin Jian Azadi. And it's really, I think, using this slogan as the kind of propelling force and under which, or the umbrella term under which these protests are energized, is really important, because I think it's a conscious and deliberate bringing together of disparate and concerns and a diversity of voices. I think there's a recognition that women's rights have to be articulated in tandem with the voices of other minority groups in the country. So the minority ethnic groups like the Kurds, the Arabs, the Baluch people. So there is a real sense that this movement, in order to be successful, has to be inclusive and all-encompassing of different voices. In terms of, could I address the headscarf issue as well? Do I have a moment to do that? Yeah. I think it's important, and I have to say I really appreciate the introductory comments by the wonderful student you had, who I thought laid it out really well, gave a really good context and kind of a rich and layered understanding of the very complex situation right now. Just a couple of things I wanted to point out. One, it's that these feminist protests in Iran have a long history. There's been over a century of feminist protests in Iran, from actually the first woman who publicly unveiled herself in the late 19th century. Her name was Tahireh Qurratul Ain. She publicly unveiled herself and then was executed for that. In the late 19th century as well, women were very involved in the tobacco protests in Iran. The early 20th century, 1905 constitutional revolution, again, women were a very active and present force. And of course, 1979, I think, is an important date to consider here, because women were very involved in bringing about the success of the revolution. But once Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, 1 month after the Islamic Republic was established, he said, well, all women have to be veiled in public. And so women went out onto the streets once again in March 1979 for 5 days of feminist protests. What was different then was that a lot of European and American women involved themselves physically, not just symbolically in the West, but feminists, American feminists and European feminists went to Iran to participate in the marches and wanted to speak at the International Women's Day conference. And this became a big problem for Iranian women, because then they had to choose. They were forced into this impossible position. If they were feminists, then they were necessarily seen as imperialists. And if they wanted to be, support the anti-imperialist revolutionary movement, they had to give up feminism. So at that time, Western intervention kind of failed Iranian women. And what's different now is that these women are putting themselves at the forefront of the movement. They're not allowing anyone to divert them from the path, but and they're not allowing feminist protests to kind of take a back seat this time, because historically women have always been asked to put their feminist concerns, place it, it's all the feminist concerns have been seen as secondary to the greater kind of revolutionary project. And I feel like that's different now. And this slogan, Woman, Life, Freedom, is really enabling this diversity of views and inclusivity of minority positions. I could say more, but maybe I'll stop here and allow my colleagues to say.
And we still have a lot of time. So,
Okay.
Ali Fatullah Nejat, now we talked a lot about the hijab, we talked about women, but more and more we have men, we have dead men, young men. I mean, I saw it mostly for Kurdistan, but I think it's all over Iran. There are many men. Sometimes it's said it's because it's my sister, my wife, my mother, but I think it's not only about, and only is, I don't want to be denigrating, about women and feminism. It's general also more. Can you tell us something what the Iranian people demand?
Well, let me also, first of all, thank you to the organizers at the University of Bielefeld for putting this together at this. It's a very timely event, and also for the very great introduction that your student did at the very beginning. Let me just, of course, I mean, the gender issue is inextricably linked to the political identity of the Islamic Republic. But of course, the case of Mahsa Amini has also been a symbol of the intersection of gender and ethnic discrimination that, non-Persian communities in Iran, especially the Kurdish people, have faced. But of course, things, this was the spark that led to a wildfire. It soon turned out to be an uprising against the entire regime. And what Nasrin Sotoudeh, the famous human rights lawyer who is imprisoned in Iran, who's the laureate of the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought of the European Parliament, said, it's basically a call for regime change. Actually, I've been working over the last 5 years on the protests very much. And I've suggested that, and maybe we're going to talk about it later on, that we're currently in a revolutionary process. But yes, I mean, the calls are quite clear. They have this kind of very, positive, symbolic, forward-looking, progressive kind of core slogan of Zan Zindagi Azadi, because of the reasons that Professor Naribi mentioned, also learning the lessons from Iranian history and the things that were, the deficits, the very, massive deficits that we've seen in 1979. And I think also for the men of Iran, they've realized that, it seems that they have learned their lesson. So understanding that women's rights cannot be detached to rights for all, so be it, in terms of gender, but also in terms of ethnicity, in terms of class. Women's rights is also an indispensable feature for any, society that wants to evolve into a democracy. So I think this is, quite understood across many sections of Iranian society. And this explains why, of course, men have joined the current uprising, led by the women and the youth of Iran.
As I said at the beginning, it's a bit difficult with Zoom to get naturally in a conversation. But before I come to my second question, Nima, Bita, do you want to say something to each other, to Ali? Ali's comment?
Thank
Please,
you.
Nima.
Maybe I'll say something. Thank you. That was really important, everything that you just said. And one of the things that I found really interesting, and I think this was, you know, maybe a week or two into the protest, the slogans, first of all, I mean, it would be fascinating to just do a study of the slogans, you know, and my favorite, of course, is the original one, Zan Zendegi Azadi. You know, it's beautiful. It doesn't wish death on anybody, and there's no violence. It's a very beautiful and inclusive slogan. What I found kind of interesting was that at one point we were hearing Mard Mihan Abadi, which, you know, loosely, I guess, translates as man, what would it be, country, homeland, whatever, and prosperity. And these, I think the slogan was chanted by the men who were protesting alongside the women, but very quickly it seemed like it didn't seem to gain traction. And I found that very interesting too, because I thought, no, this, when I heard that, I was a little worried, because I thought, here we go again. Here is 1979 again, when, you know, it's women's concerns are placed as secondary to the sort of larger societal good. But it seemed that these, maybe, you know, I don't know, or, you know, it seemed to me that these young women very quickly squashed that, you know, and men were encouraged to also use that, you know, woman, life, freedom slogan. You know, I just feel like there was a potential for a diversion of the initial protests, but I think it kind of got back on track. I'd be curious to know if my panelists agree.
Sure. May I also add something? Thank you. Well, something that I really wanted to say is that I really think that people have become more mature if we compare them with 1979, for example, especially the Generation Z that is now kind of leading this movement in a way, I would say. They have this another concept of, you know, gender. For example, I would say that it's not just the government's ideology, it was kind of also the ideology of traditional people, that a woman has to cover herself, and a man, a husband, a brother, a father is actually the protector of the woman. But this idea, in my belief, is now broken, is now changing so much, so drastically, that this feminism is actually, in my opinion, is seen so much more in the new generation. And this new generation is teaching us so many things. As a previous generation, I would say, for example, me, I am like almost 40. In our generation, we did not even have the courage to say why. But this generation not only says why, but also complains and goes inside the street, and they know that it is their right. And I really think that part of this courage that they have, part of this information that they have at the moment, is due to the technology and this global, I would say, network that we have. Yeah.
Our second part is about the contextualization, what I think is very important for the German and many other European audience. I already complained that we do not have enough information about the Iran, and I really miss background informations. And I think it's interesting, they say it's all because we don't have images, no pictures. But when I was younger, they just had a map and then they explained something about the country, yeah? So it's interesting that it seems not to be possible anymore. As a historian, I am perhaps particularly struck by the fact that the historical depth of the reporting barely reached into the last years of the Shah's regime before 1979, and mostly only the Islamic Republic. In some reports, I even heard that the Pahlavi dynasty is ascribed as century-old history. Yeah, 2000 years, one said. And this fits so much for me in an orientalizing othering of the Iran, pointed, it means the narrative is there was always this Oriental despotism, and now we have the Islamic tyranny. And I don't want to go back to my time, 16th, 17th century and what all happened there. But also, if you look into the last 150 years, it seems to me that there have really been different things happening, different evolutions, or at least progresses in some ways, and different ways of go to modernity were tried out. And this is totally, nobody talks about this. Nima Naribi already mentioned some of the things like the constitutional revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. I think nobody is too much, but only very few people in Germany know about it if they're not doing Iranian studies. Which led to the establishment of a parliament. It's not always a dynasty and a monarchy, and it's always also not always like the Shah regime in the last years. Also the attempted reforms in the 1930s that remembered me so much about Ataturk in Turkey. Also that then in 1936 the chador was forbidden. So it's really, there were always attempted reforms tried, and so there is quite a lot of political and social history in Iran, much more than an authoritarian Iran and an Islamistic regime. And I think the Iranian people had a lot of agency and they used it, but it's totally not in the picture in the reporting, the broadcasting just now. So I'd like you also to contextualize what is happening in Iran now. And you don't need to go so much into history, but also not in the last years, but also many of you already said, or Ali Fatullah Nejad said he's working for 5 years about the different riots. So I would be like to know more about the different protests before. You already mentioned it. There was 2009 against the re-election of Ahmadinejad, the protests of 2020 and 19 because of social problems. So the protests we have now, are they in this tradition? Is there something really new? And starting maybe with Nima Naribi, is this the first feminist revolution we have? And you already said it's also a long feminist movement.
Thank you so much. That's such a great question. No, I would say, there is a long history of feminist activism in Iran. Iranian women have always been very involved. Well, I shouldn't say always, but I'm looking back, let's say, to the tobacco protests, or even before that with the first woman who unveiled herself, as I mentioned, in the 19th century. But Iranian women have been politically active, they've been politically engaged, and they have tried to make interventions in state policies at different times throughout the 20th century. And you're absolutely right that this is not discussed very much in the West because of a long history of in the West of representing the Middle East, here in this specifically Iran, and Muslim women as oppressed and silent, and suffering under the what they were always referred to as the shackles of the veil, and so on. So silent and oppressed women, that's basically how we usually see Iranian women, and this couldn't be further from the truth. While Iranian women have been very politically involved and active, they've also been struggling with a patriarchal culture that has tried to hold them back and has seen them, their bodies, as symbols of, I think Professor Behravan also mentioned, as symbols of the state. So 1936 is an important moment, because that's when Reza Shah instituted the Mandatory Unveiling Act, which was traumatic, just as traumatic for women in 1936 as the eventual mandatory veiling law in 1983 for women. Because in 1936, women who had, worn the veil their entire lives and felt comfortable doing so were, their veils were violently ripped off their heads. So what this happened, what this ended up doing was that it prevented women from going out into the public sphere. So their form of, they actually resisted in that way. That was another form of political resistance, by actually refusing to go out into the public sphere and refusing Reza Shah's agenda of using their bodies as symbols of Iran's modern status. So that was a form of resistance, although it's unfortunate that it removed them from the public sphere. And I apologize, I think there's construction going on outside my house, so if there's noise. And then, after the revolution, once again, their bodies were used as, symbols of, anti-imperialism and so on. So, despite all of these attempts to, use women's bodies as symbols of modernity, or whether it's, secular modernity under the Pahlavi regime, or Islamic modernity under the Islamic regime, their women's bodies have been used in this way, but despite all of that, they're still working against those binary representations. And I think that's why this moment is so important, because I do see it as a kind of a way women are trying to move outside of these binary representations that are kind of keeping them keeping them in these inflexible, limiting categories. Right? So, I don't want to, maybe I'll let my co-panelists also contribute.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask you, Ali Fatuna Nejat. So I think it's became very clear, this feminist traditions, and I think that is something which in Germany people just didn't know, most of the people. But I think there will be also other traditions and other lines of transfer. And you said you worked a lot, and we know you worked a lot about riots. Where do you see the traditions, for example, and the connections, for example, to 2009, the big about the election?
Well, thank you for this very good question. I mean, first of all, I'm not a historian, so I cannot really comment on centuries old of Iranian history. But of course, I mean, as Professor Narabi said, there is a long tradition of feminist struggles in the modern history of Iran. So we're all aware of that. And the revolution in 1979, in the words of Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, was a revolution also of men against women. Yes, I mean, in terms of the, your student also talked about the frequency of protests that have, increased over the last years and a few decades. And probably we could start with the student uprising of 1999 that were, quite important in their favor, in their fervor. And then 10 years later, we had the 2009 Green Movement, which was largely, led by the urban middle class, demanding or protesting the outcome of the elections back then, with the main slogan of "Where is my vote?" So basically demanding political participation within the confines of the Islamic Republic. And we saw that erstwhile founding fathers of the Islamic Republic then assumed the leadership of that movement, and also, bringing in their mark on the manifesto that was written, which was more or less a reformist manifesto. I'm not saying that, there were no not more radical and revolutionary elements within this movement. So this is why I said largely. But then a decade later, we saw a different composition, basically starting with the protests at the turn of the year 2017-18, the so-called day protests. So I would actually caution against the word of riots, because riot has also perhaps a different meaning. So this uprising happened at the turn of the year 2017-18, which in my view was tremendously important, because for the first time we saw that the lower classes were driving the protests and were taking to the streets en masse and also triggered, of course, by higher food prices. But those protests also quickly spiraled out of control, so to speak, and they became very political and chanting slogans against all components of the Islamic Republic, be it the clerical, that is the ruling Shia clergy, but also the military, that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or be it the reformist or the hardline factions of the political establishment. So all components of the Islamic Republic were targeted by the people who were taken to the streets. And I think this is very much important. This, these day protests, is the name of the Iranian calendar month, and it has become a part of the political lexicon of the country and also of the elite, because this was a shock moment. Because after all, up until then, many in the field of wider Iranian studies and or studies about contemporary Iran considered the lower classes to be precisely the social base of the regime, or at least loyal to it. But we saw, tremendous political also awareness of this of these lower classes, and of course not only the lower classes, but also a different social base, which is the boundaries are very so unclear, which is the middle class poor. That is, people with middle class qualifications and aspirations. That is, people with graduate degrees, but who end up socioeconomically deprived. So those were also part of the social base of that. And back then, I argued, in a 60-page study that I wrote for Brookings, that this is a start of a long-term revolutionary process in Iran, precisely because of the fact that the lower classes were no more, very much social base of the regime anymore. It was clear that with the 2009 Green Movement, the regime had already lost much traction and appeal and also support among sections of the middle class. But so the lower classes, actually leaving, the support base of the regime was something quite dramatic in my view. And we had the de facto continuation of it with the November 29th, with the Erbil protests that turned out to be extremely bloody in the wake of a tripling, of fuel prices, which was the trigger. And they too soon turned into a anti-regime nationwide uprising. In both instances, the day and the Erbil protests, we saw also an unprecedented geographical spread. With almost 100 cities and towns being engulfed in all corners of the country. This was also a novelty, also in comparison to the 2009 Green Movement. So, and in terms of numbers, 50,000 in the first instance, 200,000 in the second instance, only according to Interior Ministry figures. So the real number may have been much larger. And of course, we had over the last few years, always, 4-digit numbers of social protests in Iran per year, from a great variety of social groups. From workers, teachers, truck drivers, students, et cetera, et cetera. According to a database that we have, which does not count, however, Persian sources, over 4,000 of those protests were registered alone last year, and in the first half of this year, 2,200. So we see, the accumulation of anger and dissatisfaction with the regime's socioeconomic as well as political performance by an growing body of social groups that up until this time around had been taken to the streets quite in a fragmented and isolated manner, where we didn't see much of a intersectional dimension to it. But this time around, it seems that we see elements from the lower and the middle classes, but even of the upper classes, if we count in the celebrities of Iran, or some of them. And also we see, quite an unprecedented ethnic solidarity. I'm not saying that this didn't exist before, but this time around it's much more virulent. So this is quite new. And in terms of the social base of the current uprising, I would say that they're, at the forefront, the women, the youth, and the students. All of them are precisely those groups who disproportionately suffer from unemployment. So that there is a accumulation of socioeconomic and political anger, and this time around, also, and also for the last 5 years, there is no more illusion that the system can be reformed. So, the reformists have not been spared from public anger in the 2017-18 uprising. And this has become, I think, quite a consensus within Iranians inside and also outside of the country, that the present system of the Islamic Republic cannot be reformed. So what I've been arguing for the last half a decade is that Iran is now in a long-term revolutionary process, very much akin to what we see in also in the Arab countries. Because if you look at the socioeconomic indicators and also the political situation, you see much more similarities than differences with Iran.
Thank you so much. Vita Beravan, where do you locate the protests now between feminist traditions and other protests? How do you see this? How do you contextualize them?
Sure. I'm not a politician, but as far as I know, and I've been following the news in 2008, in 2009, and also in 2017. For 2008 and 9, of course, it was about the voting, and it was because people were really angry because they really felt like they've been cheated on. And it was a very big movement, of course. And I'd say that all these movements that are happening actually on a timeline, they may not have the same reason. They may not have the same base. Of German, auf Deutsch sagen wir Grund. They may not have that. But what is actually the main demand of the protesters is, in the end, I would say the same. That they want this regime to either go. I mean, in previous times, there was this hope. That's the difference, I would say. In previous times, there was this hope that maybe the regime can reform itself in a way. For example, through Khatami's time, before Ahmadinejad, there were some reforms that they had been done. And unfortunately, when Ahmadinejad came, then everything changed again and stuff. People were having hope still, but now this is the time that people have lost all their hope, and they think that no reform can be done because the power that our country is actually using is a coercive power. And who uses a coercive power? A dictator. The coercive power is the power that when you do not have any other sources of power. We have, for example, referent power. We have reward power. And all these powers that an authority can have are actually, in social psychology, we say positive forms of power. But coercive one is a negative one that actually forces the people to do the things that they do not even want to do. So people now do not want this regime anymore. This is what I think. And I think maybe both of my colleagues are also, Professor Mariben and Dr. Fatullah Nejad, they also probably agree with me on this. But one thing that is also a bit different is that women are the main point of this movement at the moment, because it started with something that had been killing us inside since years. it's like Mahsa Amini's death was a kind of wake-up call for so many Iranian women inside Iran and outside Iran, that what had happened to us during our childhood, something that we were inside and we could not see what was happening to us. We could not see that this is our right to live like a human being, but now our eyes have been opened. And therefore, women are actually the main point of this movement, I would say. That is the difference, that women are actually the main point, as well as like they do not want the regime anymore. So this actually can be a connection to the other movements. Of course it is, it's a, you know, it's a process, it's a sequence, I would say. But I'm really happy about this one because it's kind of an awakening movement. I have talked to a lot of my friends. Before I did this, I thought maybe I should know some ideas about my friends as well. And they were all like giving the same idea. They said that it's like, we now know what had happened to us. You know, women are now tired of being insulted, even on the street, by the person who, for example, wears the whole hijab and thinks that since she is dressed up as the way that the government wants her, she has this power to say whatever they want. And now we know that they don't. Just because they're related to the government does not give them the right to say whatever they want to do. We might be, I mean, there's minority and majority in social psychology, but we also have a minority that might be bigger in quantity, but since they do not hold the power, they're still treated as the minority. And I think this movement is breaking that. That's my comment.
Thank you. Do you like to comment on each other?
If I could, I'll just drop it, just say a couple of things. I think that I both, you know, I agree with Professor Behrav on that it's wonderful to see and inspiring to see women at the forefront of this movement. I would just quibble a little bit with the idea that, you know, women have, that this is an awakening, because I think that when we cast that, when we have that historical lens, you know, on the women's involvement at different points in history and since 1979 in political movements, in movements for social and political change, we see that, you know, I think they've always known what they want. It's just that they've tried to come at it from different angles, right? So maybe there was more appetite for working within the system. Maybe there was more appetite for reform, as both you and Dr. Fatullah Nejad have pointed out. And now people are fed up, right? Now there's just no more. They're not interested in reform. So I would just say that, you know, that's what I just wanted to, I think they always knew what they wanted, but they were trying to come at it from different angles. You know, how do we achieve what we want? But with, you know, the murder of Mahsa Amini, and, you know, a young woman, you know, young Kurdish woman from a modest background who was dressed according to the, you know, the law, and just had a little strand of hair showing, to have her so brutally, you know, murdered was just, I think, the last straw. And the other thing I just wanted to say, that I think it's really important to mention this, and in fact, I was, your student also mentioned this, that what's happening now, I mean, I think this sort of the revolutionary protests of this past month, I think are doing two important things at the same time. They're making important interventions for radical social and political change, while they're gesturing back to historical grievances and traumatic moments. And this generation is carrying that forward, right? And so they're carrying not only their own suffering, but the grievances and the trauma and the failed hopes of their parents' generation, of their grandparents' generation, you know, and I think that's sort of what's propelling them forward, that actually, you know, intergenerational memory and memory of past traumatic experiences that their mothers and grandmothers have carried and endured. And that's part of what's propelling this movement forward.
And as a third and last part of our panel, I would like to raise the question, what can the West, what can Germany do? And I mean, it's not only the media that have been so silent. The governments and politicians remained silent too, very much. Yeah. The first voice was, to my knowledge, Canada, who said quite early something. Now Britain is talking about personalized sanctions. The European Union, I'd like to phrase it, started thinking about if they want to do something. And here it seems, and also our student raised that problem before, that they maybe think that the nuclear deal is more important than human rights. And my feeling was also that they were more annoyed about Iranian drones in the Ukraine than about what is happening in the Iran. In the last week's issue of Die Zeit, Nathalie Amiri, an important German-Iranian journalist, called for the feminist foreign policy. And I mean, Annalena Baerbock started being a foreign minister, and the whole Green Party started also for the election with this feminist foreign policy, meaning it's not only about soldiers, it's about all of us, it's about the rights and the problems of women. And that seems really the question, what can we do? And I also want to notice here, to say here that we have really tried to invite somebody from the German side, from the political side, who could say something about feminist foreign policy, about what is the government doing. And the academics, it was on too short notice. For the people from the political field we asked, we had the feeling it was just too hot. Yeah, nobody wanted to come. So I'd like to know what you think about what can the West, what can Germany do? And on the other hand, now again, being a historian, if I look back into the history of Iran, Europe and the West have interfered maybe too often. Yeah, so we have at the turn of the 20th century, the British quasi-colonialism, and also never really mentioned in the discourse, we have the Mohammad Mossadegh's government in 1953, which was a government who stood for a modern and self-determined Iran, as much as I understood. You will certainly know better, but it were British and US intelligence agency who were crucial for his fall when he started to nationalize Iranian oil production. So, I mean, the West should not always come and say we know it all better. So it's a bit a dilemma, and I would very much like to know what you think, what can we do? And I'd like Ali Fatullah-Nejad, you as an expert for foreign, transatlantic foreign policy, and as far as I know, do a lot of research, how we can bring together interests and values. Maybe you like to start what you think about it?
Well, sure. I mean, well, where should I start? Let's start in the recent past when it came to European reactions to the two uprisings that I mentioned earlier, the Auban and the Day and the Auban protests. And actually, those were quite reluctant and quite revealing because what many European governments did, they called upon both sides to stop the violence, so which is quite indicative. There has been, so this was interpreted as a sign of sympathy to the regime rather than society in Iran. And of course, we have to, take a look at European interests, or how they have been defined, at least. And of course, one major issue is the fear of destabilization. That could also lead to, in the wider Persian Gulf region, that could lead to higher oil prices, which is quite important for Europe. Secondly, the fear of another refugee wave coming out of this kind of destabilization. And so this is, you know, also not very dissimilar to European, but also US foreign policy toward the region, toward the entire Middle East, under the paradigm of authoritarian stability. So this has been, you know, the trademark of, you know, Western foreign policies for decades already. And in the case of Iran, as I've argued in the past, this has been no different. So I think those concerns, although I would classify them as merely short-term, because in reality, I mean, first of all, Iran is still one of the, I think, top 3 countries when it comes to refugees. And then the question would be if the Islamic Republic is a stable country, with the outburst of, you know, popular anger at such a high frequency. And the state brutality in response that is also, I mean, while also the internet is shut down, there are also tremendous economic costs associated with it. So I think, so the presumption of this, you know, authoritarian stability paradigm, I would argue are, you know, false, are not correct, and they do not serve to bring about stability in the mid or long term. So, you know, I mean, the Arab Spring should have kicked off a rethinking of this paradigm, which has not happened for more than a decade. Because as the Arab Spring has shown, socioeconomic development and political development are key to stability. So, yes, and when it comes to feminist foreign policy, the trademark of the Green Party in Germany, but also of some other Nordic countries in Europe, of course, this would have been the time to put it into practice. And what better time if not, you know, with this uprising in Iran. But as you know, reactions have been quite reluctant. You know, the EU sanctions that were imposed earlier this week on Monday are extremely thin. I mean, those are very few, so they're not serious at all. Also, when compared to the Canadian government that has imposed the sanctions against 10,000 members of the IRGC. So yes, there is a tremendous criticism vis-a-vis the Green Party, also from the German Iranian community, but also, based on evidence, that they have not been willing to deliver on putting into practice their kind of feminist foreign policy. And I think the major concern in the policy area is the nuclear issue. And there are also, the threat of a nuclear bomb at the hands of the Iranian regime, and our policymakers are still making the case that, listen, this would be, the worst case scenario. Whereas I think there are, other dimension. A lot of aspects to account for. But yes, the reluctance over the past few years was also because of the nuclear issue, because after the JCPOA was signed, the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, then implemented in 2016, there was tremendous reluctance from the European side back then, also from the Obama administration, in criticizing Tehran for its human rights issue at home, but also its expansive regional policies, because the fear was that Tehran would walk away from the nuclear deal. But then again, I think, there have been, false presumptions here. First of all, Iran is also very much interested in reviving the deal because of the, money that would be defrozen and accessible in the wake of sanctions lifting with a revived deal. I think there is also not a, I don't have the time to go into all the policy details here, but another major factor is that I think there is, it's very much, also akin to the Russia debate that we've seen in Germany and Europe, with, for instance, President Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So I think a lot of autocracies and dictatorships on this planet use somehow similar tactics of fear and intimidation to scare away, especially European governments, to be more robust in their behavior. So I think the Islamic Republic is doing something similar with its nuclear program. It is, it is using nuclear escalation as a kind of pressure to the West, and so that it can rush back to the negotiating table and provide as much concessions as possible. But the last point I would like to stress is that there is, I think, maybe there is some understanding now that the Islamic Republic may not be reformable, and it has lost a lot of legitimacy, if not all. So maybe, there is, some minor realization here, but there is still very much the concern that if we give up the nuclear talks, Iran gonna emerge as a nuclear power, a nuclear weapon state, and it has more influence of blackmail. But I think, the debate is more complex than this. And I have been arguing that this is an opportune time to put a halt to the nuclear negotiations, because there is a fear that in the wake of a revitalized deal with a regime that is largely illegitimate, those funds are going to be used for regime stability purposes, be it inside the country, but also outside of the country. Something that we've seen also in the past few years after the JCPOA, the first JCPOA. And so there is no understanding that this may be a historical moment where Europe should take sides not only on moral grounds, but also on long-term interests. Because after all, in Iran that, post-Islamic Republic would not pursue the same kind of policies, I would guess, be it internally or externally. So I would argue that it's now time for a new Iran strategy that is more comprehensive and that takes into account the issue of human rights. After all, also the German government has pledged in its coalition agreements to pursue a foreign policy that is centered on or that uses human rights as a compass. And also there are similar documents at the European level that suggest the same. So a comprehensive Iran approach that takes seriously human rights, regional policies, but also the nuclear issue. But all of that is somehow connected. And I think there are creative ways to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I go to our other discussions, I want to say for everybody again aloud, the chat is open now. You can write questions into the chat, and it would be great if you say as to whom your question is related. Bita Berawan, you said before in our talk before that you are not a political scientist, but on a general level, what do you wish for us to do?
On a general level, I would say it's not really right to cooperate with a regime who is killing children on the streets. This is something that has to be done, I think. It should be stopped, this cooperation. I know that it will be even harder for people, but I think the regime, if it loses the resources that it feeds from, then little by little it will get weaker and weaker. Of course, it is already so much weaker than it used to be, but then I think sanctions can help. But another thing that I would say is through media and through spreading the voice of Iranian people in Europe, I would say, I know that, in compared to the other movements that had been happening in Iran, this movement has been shown more and had been talked about more in other countries, but still there is so much more to do, I think. Just spreading the voice of Iranian people to the world, especially also Iranian women, that they do not want this. And one thing that I'm happy about is that the whole world now has a clear image that what people want is absolutely different than what the governments want. Because before this, I think there was still some doubts and some people couldn't really say that, yeah, that's true. Yeah, Iranians are all around the world. Some people might have heard about it from their own friends and acquaintances, but at the moment, I think at least it has become more clear for the world that people really do not want this regime. And maybe through helping them with internet access, I really don't know if it's possible, but Iranian people are now suffering from filtering of internet at the moment, and therefore, their voice cannot be broadcast as much as it could have been before the internet was filtered and limited. So this is what I think, and I hope that it can be done. Maybe some symposiums, some more meetings, I don't know, in different, maybe universities, I don't know, also inside the parliament, for example. Mr. Omid Nouripour, he is the person who I actually look up to because I think he's been really active, but I still think that there is so much more to do, and the politicians can actually talk about it. They can also address the Iranian government directly and condemn them and ask them to stop it. Otherwise, for example, there would be more sanctions. I think that the only way is to push and push and push, because unfortunately, I think that this government will not stop only by saying that, yes, we are, I don't know, we ask you not to do this, or I don't know, we condemn this. Unless something practical is done, I really don't think that they would stop killing people. And I really do hope that the protests will succeed. Yeah.
Thank you. Nima Nagibi, you said in your last or the first comment that Western feminism betrayed Iranian women in 1979. I had a similar discussion with a lawyer, feminist lawyer in the US, but from Egypt, who said in the Arabic Spring, and was similar. So what do you wish from Western feminism to do?
Okay, that's a big question. Yeah, I think something that's different, that feels different this time around, is that Western feminists are supportive of women in Iran and of the movement by trying to, by reposting, let's say on social media, videos that they have access to, by expressing their, support and solidarity without claiming a leadership position. And I think that was the big problem in 1979, that, for example, famously, Kate Millett, the American feminist, second wave feminist, went to Iran and was very excited about the movement and insisted on speaking at the International Women's Day conference. And that was a problem. So, and 1970s feminists at that time thought that they were in a position to teach Iranian women how to fight for their rights. I think now people are seeing that Iranian women don't need to be taught anything, but they need to be supported. And so using that term that, maybe to a certain extent is overused now, but, the amplification of voices is a good thing, rather than kind of taking over, and claiming ownership of voices, or this idea of speaking for or being somebody's voice. These were all problematic interventions that I would like to think, I'm hoping, won't be repeated. Now, there are certain elements, certain feminists in the diaspora who are claiming to be, the voice of Iranian women in Iran, claiming to be the leader of the feminist movement, but which is completely, fallacious. But I think for the most part, what's happening is there seems to be a supportive wave, you know, and you kind of see that with at the protests, various protests where, you know, people are there, they're not trying to take over, they're just there in solidarity. And I think that that's an important difference. And I think keeping this issue alive in the media, with panels like this, there have been a lot of panels around this issue through universities, and I think that's really important because we're keeping the discussion and the issues alive and keeping them we're still talking about what's going on in Iran. I think it will be very dangerous if it falls out of conversations, because as an example, the Elnaz Rekabi, the Iranian rock climber who was competing in South Korea and without her hijab. There was a lot of fear around what's going to happen to her when she goes back to Iran. There was even some concerns that she had disappeared. But when she returned to Iran, she was greeted by this huge crowd of people supporting her. And she was very much in the news and on social media in the West. And so I feel like the regime's hands were tied at that particular moment. You know, if they had done something to her, it would have been very obvious that it was the government who had committed this crime. So they forced her to issue an apology. It was clearly a forced apology, but at least at this point she's still alive, and hopefully she'll stay that way. So I think keeping the issues alive and present at the forefront of conversations in the West is important.
Thank you. So it just remains to thank you again for this wonderful discussion, for all the time you took, for sharing your expertise, for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. And I think if we could also switch, I mean, the audience can't switch on their mics on their own, so they can't clap, but I think we should give you at least some small round of applause.
Thank you.
And I hope we stay in touch. And
thank you so much. I also just want to take this opportunity to thank you again for the invitation, and you know, thank you to my co-panelists, and it's just been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great.
please come back.
Yes, definitely. And it was such a pleasure also to see Professor Naribi and also Dr. Fatullah Nejad and all of you, Dr. Flüchter, Dr. Fürster, Dr. König und alle anderen in diesem Raum. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, and I hope that we will triumph.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. All the best.
Women, life, freedom.